My name is Joseph Winters. I'm associate professor here at Duke University in religious studies and African American studies. Before I talk a little bit about the virtues of a liberal studies education, I want to thank the provost, Sally Kornbluth, right, and also Gary Bennett for inviting me to introduce the class of 2024 to Duke University and the kind of comprehensive education that we offer here. I want to congratulate the class of 2024, even though these are obviously difficult, unusual times that we're all facing. It's important to step back sometimes and celebrate, good moments, accomplishments, and achievements, and certainly being accepted to Duke University is one of them. So I want to congratulate all of you. So I want to say just talk a little bit about, what we mean by a liberal arts education, what we mean by the humanities, and the kinds of courses that I teach that I think, fit a kind of liberal arts interdisciplinary model. I want to start by talking about my own undergraduate education and experience. In 1995, I started at Harvard University in Massachusetts. I was an economics major, right? I was an economics major with an emphasis in applied math. But even as I was an economics major, I took courses in African American studies. I took courses in religion and film. I remember I took a very influential course on Confucianism. So even though these courses weren't part of my major, right, they weren't part of my concentration, these courses certainly broadened my understanding, right? Not just understanding of the world, but a broader understanding of what a college education can offer. I remember that even though my economics courses were formative, they taught me a lot. I often saw those courses as I had to get problem sets finished for the week, but it was the courses in religion and film, courses in, like I said, Confucianism, where I felt like I was having conversations outside of class. I was having conversations in the dorm with classmates and friends, conversations over dinner, right, where we were debating and arguing, right? And in doing that, right, I was learning how to think differently about the world, right? So fast forward, and now I'm a professor of, right, no longer economics, but I'm a professor of religious studies and African American studies with secondary appointments in English and gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, right? I think that right there, the fact that I have, commitments and I participate in four different departments, just there kind of, is emblematic of the possibilities at Duke, right? For both professors and for students, right? Many of my courses are cross-listed. Many of the courses that you'll take are cross-listed, which shows that many of the courses don't fit in one particular discipline, right? When I think of a broad liberal arts education, I think of, interdisciplinary work, right? Taking courses that apply to religious studies, anthropology, African American studies, gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, right? And how those intersect, right? How those combine, right? How those different kind of methods and disciplines are informing how we think about the world, right? But so when we think of liberal arts education, certainly we think of something, right? Kind of comprehensive education, right? So you can take your courses in science, math, also English, religion, and so forth. But I think when I think about a broad liberal arts education, I'm thinking about a constellation of questions, right? Right? Questions that you might not be able to completely answer now or in the next 4 years, but certainly questions that I think you should think about. One is, why are you here? Right? And I don't mean just here on earth or existence. I mean, why are you at Duke? Right? What does a college education provide and offer you? Right? I mean, obviously there are certain professional aspirations that we all have, right? Getting a job is necessary. But in addition, right, to that, right, in addition to the professional aspirations, right, why do you want to take certain courses, right? What do certain courses professors have to offer? What is a classroom experience, right, where you're debating, arguing, learning, listening, right? All of those habits and skills, right? How are those skills transferable beyond, right, the workplace, right? But about the formation of, right, citizens, the formation of humans, the formation of subjects. How is all of that important? Right. Another question you want to think about is, right, in addition to that, there's certainly an instrumental dimension of education, right? So you're taking this course, right, because you want to, right, get a degree. You're taking this course because you got to fulfill a requirement. You're taking this course because you want to, right, you're thinking about grad school or your professional commitments. But there's something, right, in addition to the instrumental dimension of a course, right, or the classroom experience, there's another aspect of it, right, which is in the process of learning, right? So what I'm trying to get at here is, right, there's something about liberal arts education that's about study, right? That's about thinking, right? That's about learning how to think differently, think critically, think synthetically, and think with other people, right? And so, right, I think that part of what I loved about the college experience is that some of my most important and most generative conversations were not just in the classroom, but those that spilled out of the classroom, right? As I said earlier, right? So again, when I'm thinking about a comprehensive education, I'm thinking about certain questions about, why are you taking this class, right? What do we mean by education? What do we mean by formation, right? Are we just learning about, information, right, or facts? Or are we learning how to think about the world, right? How to imagine or reimagine the world, right? Through, right, the courses, through the conversations, through the readings, right, that are part of, right, the classroom, right, and course experience, right? Another thing I want to take seriously, right, is when I think about the liberal, kind of liberal arts education, I think about the term humanities, right? Now humanities here usually refers to certain kinds of classes, right? Think of, English, literature, religious studies, visual studies, history, right? It's usually seen as, the opposite of the sciences. I don't necessarily think about it like that. But I do think about the term human, right? Like the term that makes up the humanities, right? What does it mean to study human value, right? What does it mean to study human culture, right? What does it mean when the human is the object, right, of study and analysis and research, right? What does it mean if you take seriously the legacies of racism, sexism, right, colonization, and so forth? What does it mean to take seriously that the human has been a social construct that has often excluded certain populations, that has often excluded certain kinds of, right, cultures, right, often excluded certain kinds of values as being not quite human or not ideally human, right? So the very study of humanities is not just the study of the human, but the study of what the human defines itself against, right? So it's the study of race, class, gender, right? It's the study of trying to maybe either expand our conception of the human, right? Or maybe to imagine other kinds of categories, right? That include both human, the non-human, and so forth, right? And finally, I just want to say a little bit about one of the fields that I look at and how this relates to a broader liberal arts education, and that is a course I teach on religion and hip hop. Right? So let me just say a little bit about what I mean by religion and hip hop. Right? Hip hop for me doesn't just begin with Megan Thee Stallion or Drake, right? As much as I enjoy listening to them, hip hop for me is what I would call a kind of a constellation of cultural practices and modes of being that begin, right, in, some people would say the Bronx or New York City in the early to mid 1970s. Right? Practices that included graffiti, breakdancing, rap, DJing, but then went on to include, right, sartorial styles, clothing, aesthetic styles, filmmaking, right, and so forth. Right? Hip hop for me, begins in a certain place. So it has roots, right, in places like New York City, the Bronx, or Queens, but it has roots, right? It has trajectories, right, that go beyond the Bronx, that go beyond the United States, right? When I talk about religion, right, I mean two things, right? I mean, right, various traditions that we associate with religion, like Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, right, Candomblé, and so forth. But I also mean, right, religion in a more broader sense, which is, right, the kinds of practices and rites that pertain to sacred objects, right? What I mean by religiosity in this moment is, right, how do we imagine and construct the sacred, right? How do we make distinctions between what's sacred and what's profane? And in that way, even secular practices and secular spaces, like Duke University, have sacred spaces. You'll learn that when you start going to basketball games, right? In addition to the chapel, for instance, right? There are other spaces that are seen as sacred, that are seen as special and significant, and they're set apart from other spaces, right? On the campus. So for me, when I think of religiosity, and I think of religion, I think of, right, how we imagine and reimagine the sacred. And so when I teach my religion and hip hop course, and when I write about hip hop and religion, I focus on, I don't just focus on, Christian hip hop, right, or Muslim hip hop or Buddhist hip hop. I also focus on, right, what I call a more underlying, right, or a more general conception of religion, right? How are artists, right, wrestling with things like evil, tragedy, violence, right? How are they creating meaning, right? How are they creating energy and hope in the face of, right, violence, in the face of suffering, in the face of anguish? For me, there's a kind of religiosity, right, to those kinds of struggles, right? Those kinds of existential struggles, right? What Anthony Pinn would call the search for a complex subjectivity, right? In the face of, right, anguish, in the face of tragedy. For me, there's a kind of religious sensibility, right? Or kind of spirituality that is part of a lot of hip hop artists, part of a lot of hip hop and rap artists, even if they don't go to a temple or a mosque or a synagogue, right? There's a religious sensibility that's not reducible to, right, religious institutions, right, or religious traditions, right, that we can always identify, right? So that's just one example, right, for me of when you teach a course on religion in hip hop, you have to think about, right, a whole bunch of stuff, right? History, right? You got to think about how socioeconomic conditions created the possibility for hip hop. So you got to take seriously capitalism, social economics. You got to take seriously the history of Black aesthetics, jazz, blues, rock and roll, spirituals, and how they, right, prefigure, right, and inspire hip hop, right? You got to take seriously Black studies, African American studies, right? And also, right, when I teach that course, it's an introduction to religion. It's an introduction to theories of the sacred, right? So just in that course alone, right, regardless of how it's cross-listed, in that course alone, we're already spanning and covering, right, multiple disciplines, right, multiple approaches to the human, multiple approaches to religion, multiple approaches to hip hop. And I think a course like that is just one of many courses that you can take at Duke to get a kind of comprehensive liberal arts experience. Thank you all for listening to me, right? I hope that your orientation goes well. And again, in these unusual, difficult times, wishing you the best, as you begin, your journey here at Duke University. Thank you.